The muddy water swirled around Grace Thompson's boots as she stood frozen on the far bank of Clearwater Creek, watching the brown torrent rise between her and safety with terrifying speed. She had crossed this creek 100 times in her 20 years, knew every rock and shallow crossing, but the spring storm that had blown through Yuma, Arizona last night had transformed the gentle stream into a churning beast. The basket of herbs she had gathered from her mother's favorite spot lay forgotten at her feet as panic tightened around her chest like iron bands. The ranch house sat visible on the opposite side, close enough that she could see the white curtains in the kitchen window, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles away. The water was rising so fast she could actually watch it climb the red clay banks, swallowing stone after stone. Grace had left the house just after dawn on this April morning in 1883, telling her mother she would be back before breakfast. The creek had been running high but manageable then, the water clear enough to see the bottom. She had waded across carefully, her skirts bundled up around her knees, thinking only of the wild sage and yerba mansa that grew in abundance on the eastern side. Her mother needed them for the medicines she prepared for the ranch hands and the occasional traveler who stopped at their property seeking help. But somewhere during the hour Grace had spent gathering plants, the storm waters from the mountains must have finally reached this valley. Now the creek stretched at least 30 feet across, and the current moved with a force that would sweep a grown man off his feet. She cupped her hands around her mouth and called out, but the roar of the water swallowed her voice. The main house was too far, and her father had taken the wagon into Yuma with her younger brother to pick up supplies. Only her mother was home, and she would be busy with the cooking, nowhere near a window that faced the creek. Grace felt the first real stab of fear pierce through her initial shock. She could wait it out, she told herself. The water would go down eventually. But even as she tried to calm herself, she noticed the dark clouds gathering again to the north, promising more rain. The sound of hoofbeats cut through her spiraling thoughts. Grace whirled around to see a rider coming hard across the open ground behind her, a horse and man moving together like a single creature. The horse was a big buckskin gelding, and the man sat him with the easy confidence of someone born in the saddle. As he drew closer, Grace recognized him as one of the men who had signed on with her father 3 weeks ago. Matthew Stone, that was his name. He was tall and lean, probably in his mid-20s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of creek water on a calm day. She had noticed him around the ranch, always working, never idle, but they had exchanged no more than a few polite greetings. Matthew pulled his horse to a stop several yards back from the bank and swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion. His expression was serious as he took in the situation, his gaze moving from Grace to the raging creek and back again. "Miss Thompson," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the water. "When did you cross?" "Maybe an hour ago," Grace shouted back. "It was nothing then. I did not know it would rise like this." Matthew nodded, already moving, his hands working quickly to secure his hat to the saddle horn. He checked the cinch on his horse, tightening it another notch, then swung back up. The buckskin danced sideways, sensing his rider's tension and the danger of the water ahead. Grace watched with growing alarm as she realized what he intended to do. "Wait," she cried out. "It is too dangerous. I can wait for the water to go down." "More rain coming," Matthew said, pointing to the north. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. Your mother saw you were not back and sent me to check." He gathered his reins and looked at her steadily across the water. "I am coming across. When I get there, you are going to climb up behind me. Keep your arms around my waist and do not let go no matter what happens. Understand?" Grace wanted to argue, wanted to tell him not to risk himself, but the set of his jaw told her it would be useless. She nodded instead, her heart hammering against her ribs. Matthew backed his horse up several paces, then turned him to face the creek head-on. For a moment, horse and rider stood perfectly still. Then Matthew touched his heels to the buckskin's sides and they plunged forward into the brown water. The current hit them immediately with tremendous force. Grace saw the water surge up around the horse's chest, saw the animal's head come up as he fought to keep his footing. Matthew sat deep in the saddle, his weight centered, his hands steady on the reins. The buckskin was a strong swimmer, his powerful legs driving them forward even as the current tried to sweep them downstream. Grace lost sight of them for a terrifying moment as a wave broke over the horse's head. Then they emerged again, closer now, fighting for every foot. The horse lost his footing twice, and each time Grace's heart stopped as she watched Matthew somehow keep his seat and guide the animal back to steadier ground beneath the water. It seemed to take forever, though it could only have been a minute or two. Then the buckskin's front hooves were striking solid ground and he was lunging up the bank, water streaming from his coat. Matthew did not waste time on words. He extended his hand down to Grace, his eyes urgent. "Now," he said. Grace grabbed her basket with one hand and reached up with the other. Matthew's grip was strong and sure as he pulled her up behind him. She wrapped her free arm around his waist as instructed, feeling the solid warmth of him through his wet shirt, and barely had time to settle before he was turning the horse back toward the water. "Hold tight," he said, and then they were entering the creek again. The return crossing was even more terrifying from horseback. Grace could feel the raw power of the water as it battered against them, could feel the horse struggle beneath her as the current did its best to tear them away. She pressed her face against Matthew's back and held on with all her strength, her fingers locked together at his waist. The basket handle bit into her wrist, but she did not dare let go of it either. The horse grunted with effort, his breathing loud and labored. Matthew spoke to him constantly, his voice low and encouraging, too quiet for Grace to make out the words but the tone clear enough. Then miraculously they were across, the horse heaving himself up the western bank with the last of his strength. Matthew guided him up the slope and away from the water before pulling him to a halt. The buckskin stood with his head down, sides heaving like bellows, water dripping from every part of him. Matthew dismounted and immediately turned to help Grace down. Her legs were shaking so badly she nearly fell, but his hands steadied her, holding her upright until she found her balance. "Are you hurt?" Matthew asked, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made something flutter in her chest. "No," Grace managed, her voice coming out shaky. "Thanks to you. That was the bravest thing I have ever seen." Matthew shook his head, dismissing the praise. Just doing what needed doing. But his hands lingered on her arms a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back and turned his attention to his horse. He ran his hands over the buckskin's legs, checking for injury, then loosened the cinch to let the animal breathe easier. "Good boy, Buck," he murmured, rubbing the horse's forehead. "You did real good." Grace watched him tend to his horse with gentle, capable hands, and something shifted in her chest. She had known cowboys all her life, grown up among men who worked cattle and horses, but there was something different about Matthew Stone. Something in the quiet competence of his movements, the way he had not hesitated to risk his life for her, the way he put his horse's welfare before his own comfort even now when he must be exhausted. "How did you know I was out here?" she asked. "Your mother noticed you had been gone longer than usual. She was starting to worry about the creek, asked me to ride out and check." Matthew straightened up and met her eyes. "Lucky I did." "Lucky," Grace repeated softly. "Yes, I do not know how to thank you. No thanks needed." Matthew gathered Buck's reins and started walking toward the ranch house, leading the tired horse. Grace fell into step beside him, very aware suddenly of how she must look with her skirts soaked and muddy, her hair coming loose from its braid. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds their footsteps and the horse's hooves and the distant roar of the creek behind them. "You are not from around here," Grace said finally, more to break the silence than anything. "No, madam, Texas originally. Been working my way west." Matthew glanced at her sideways. "Your father offered me steady work and I needed it. Seems like a good place." "It is," Grace said. "My parents built this ranch 15 years ago right after they married. It was nothing but desert and dreams then. Now we run 200 head of cattle and have some of the best water in the territory." She paused. "At least we do when the creek is not trying to kill people." That drew a small smile from Matthew, the first she had seen. It transformed his whole face, softening the serious lines around his mouth. "That creek has a temper, all right, but the land here is good. A man could make something of himself in a place like this." He said it almost to himself, then seemed to catch himself and added, "if he was lucky enough to have the chance." They were approaching the house now, and Grace could see her mother standing on the porch, one hand shading her eyes. When Elizabeth Thompson caught sight of them, she rushed down the steps, her face pale with relief and residual fear. "Grace, thank God. I was so worried when Matthew came back without you at first and had to cross again. I should never have sent you out this morning. I knew the creek was high." "I am fine, Mama," Grace assured her, accepting her mother's tight embrace. "Matthew got me across safely. He saved my life." Elizabeth turned to Matthew, who stood a respectful distance away, still holding his horse's reins. "Mr. Stone, I do not know how to thank you. What you did was incredibly brave." Matthew ducked his head, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Just glad I was here to help, madam. Now if you will excuse me, I should get Buck rubbed down and dried off. He did all the hard work." "Nonsense," Elizabeth said firmly. "That horse needs care and so do you. Grace, go inside and get changed into dry clothes. Mr. Stone, there is a stall in the barn with clean straw. See to your horse and then come to the house. You will have hot food and coffee and I will hear no arguments about it." Matthew looked like he wanted to argue anyway, but something in Elizabeth's expression must have convinced him it was useless. He nodded and led Buck toward the barn. Grace watched him go, still feeling the phantom warmth of his body against hers, the strength of his arms as he had pulled her onto the horse. "That is quite a young man," Elizabeth said quietly, following her daughter's gaze. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He is very brave." "Brave and kind and hardworking from what your father says. He has been impressed with Mr. Stone's work these past weeks." Elizabeth put an arm around Grace's shoulders. "Come on, let us get you warm and dry. You are shivering." Grace had not even noticed the cold, but now that her mother mentioned it, she realized she was soaked through and the April morning was not warm. She let her mother lead her inside, but her thoughts stayed on the man in the barn and the way he had looked at her when he made sure she was unharmed. An hour later, dressed in dry clothes with her hair properly braided again, Grace helped her mother prepare a substantial breakfast. They cooked more than usual, eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits with gravy, the kind of meal meant to warm a man from the inside out after an ordeal. Grace found herself taking extra care with the biscuits, making sure they were perfect. When Matthew finally knocked on the kitchen door, she was the one who opened it. He had changed into dry clothes as well, though his hair was still damp and curling more than before. He held his hat in his hands and looked uncertain, as if he still was not sure he belonged in the main house. Most of the ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse or the cook shack, and the main house was family territory. but Elizabeth waved him in before he could protest. "Sit down, Mr. Stone. You have earned this meal 10 times over." Elizabeth pointed to the table where they had set a place for him. "Grace, pour the coffee, please." They ate together, the three of them, and gradually Matthew's stiffness eased as Elizabeth drew him into conversation. She had a gift for making people comfortable, and before long, Matthew was talking more freely about his life before Yuma. He had grown up on a ranch in Texas, he told them, learning cattle and horses from his father. But a drought had ruined them when Matthew was 20, and his father had died the following winter from pneumonia. His mother had gone to live with her sister in Dallas, and Matthew had set out to make his own way. "I worked ranches all through Texas and New Mexico," he said. "Saved what I could. I have a mind to start my own place someday, though that is still a few years off at best." "It is a good dream," Elizabeth said warmly. "This country needs men with ambition and integrity. Is that what brought you to Arizona?" "Partly. I had heard there was good land to be had here and work for a man willing to put his back into it." Matthew glanced at Grace, then quickly away. "I am glad I came." After the meal, Matthew thanked them and excused himself to get back to work. He had responsibilities, he said, and he had already taken up too much of the morning. Grace walked him to the door, very aware of her mother's knowing eyes on her back. "Thank you again," Grace said softly, "for what you did, for coming after me." Matthew settled his hat on his head and looked at her with those creek-colored eyes. "I would do it again in a heartbeat, Miss Thompson. You take care near that water from now on." "I will," Grace promised. "And please call me Grace. After this morning, I think we can dispense with formalities." A slow smile spread across Matthew's face. "Only if you call me Matthew, or Matt if you prefer." "Matthew," Grace said, trying the name on her tongue. She liked the shape of it, the way it felt in her mouth. "I will see you at supper, Matthew. My father should be back by then, and I know he will want to hear about this morning." "Looking forward to it," Matthew said, and something in his tone made Grace's heart skip. Then he was walking away toward the corrals, and Grace was left standing in the doorway watching him go. The rest of that day seemed to drag. Grace went about her usual chores, helping her mother with the washing and the mending, preparing vegetables for the evening meal, but her mind kept wandering back to those terrifying minutes at the creek. She kept seeing Matthew on his horse, plunging into that raging water without hesitation, kept feeling the security of his arms around her on the ride back, the steady strength of him. She had known handsome men before, had even been courted briefly by the banker's son in town, but she had never felt this odd combination of safety and excitement, this sense that something important had shifted in her world. Her father and brother returned in the late afternoon, the wagon loaded with supplies from town. Grace watched from the kitchen window as her mother went out to meet them, saw the way her father's expression changed as Elizabeth spoke to him, no doubt telling him what had happened. Robert Thompson was a big man, broad across the shoulders and weathered by years in the Arizona sun, but he moved fast when he wanted to. Within minutes, he was striding toward the corrals where Matthew was working with one of the young horses. Grace could not hear what was said, but she saw her father extend his hand and Matthew shake it. Saw her father clap Matthew on the shoulder in the way he did when he was pleased with someone. Her younger brother Jacob, who was 16 and thought he knew everything, had wandered over to join them, and soon all three men were talking animatedly. Grace smiled to herself as she turned back to her work. Her father was a good judge of character, and she knew he would appreciate what Matthew had done. Supper that night was a lively affair. The whole family gathered around the table, and this time Matthew had been explicitly invited by Robert himself. Jacob peppered Matthew with questions about the creek crossing. wanting every detail, until their mother finally told him to hush and let the poor man eat. But Robert wanted to hear the story too, and Matthew obliged, though Grace noticed he downplayed the danger and made it sound simpler than it had been. The horse did most of the work, Matthew insisted. Buck is as steady as they come. I just pointed him in the right direction. That is not how Grace tells it, Robert said, his eyes twinkling. She says you rode through that current like a man possessed, never mind your own safety. Matthew's ears went red and Grace took pity on him. Papa, you are embarrassing him. Can we please talk about something else? Like what? Jacob asked innocently. This is the most exciting thing that has happened around here in months. Elizabeth redirected the conversation to the supplies they had brought back from town, and the meal continued more peacefully. But Grace noticed the way her father watched Matthew throughout the evening, his expression thoughtful. She knew that look. Her father was evaluating, considering, planning something in that sharp mind of his. After supper, as Grace and her mother cleaned up, Elizabeth spoke quietly. Your father is very impressed with Matthew. He should be, Grace said, scrubbing a plate perhaps more vigorously than necessary. Matthew risked his life today. Yes, he did, for you. Elizabeth paused in her work and looked at her daughter. Grace, I am going to ask you something as your mother. What do you think of Matthew Stone? Grace set down the plate carefully and met her mother's eyes. There was no point in lying or playing coy. Her mother knew her too well. I think he is the most remarkable man I have ever met, she said honestly. I know I have only really known him for a day, but Mama, when he rode into that water today, something happened to me. I cannot explain it. Elizabeth smiled, a soft, knowing smile. You do not have to explain it. I felt the same way about your father when I first met him. Sometimes you just know. She touched Grace's cheek gently. But take your time, sweetheart. Get to know him properly. If he is the man we think he is, he will be worth the wait. Over the following weeks, Grace found opportunities to do exactly that. It was not difficult on a working ranch where everyone pitched in and paths crossed constantly. She brought water to the men working in the corrals and always made sure to linger to talk to Matthew. She helped her father with the books in the evening, and Matthew was often there too, discussing the cattle or the repairs needed on the fences. She rode out to check on the herd with her father, and Matthew rode with them, pointing out things he had noticed, showing his knowledge of cattle and land management. They talked about everything. Matthew told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to rope from his father, about the first horse he had trained all by himself. Grace told him about her childhood here in Arizona, about the early days when they had lived in a small adobe house while her father built up the herd, about her dreams of maybe becoming a teacher someday, helping educate the children of the scattered ranches and small towns in the area. You would be good at that, Matthew said. They were sitting on the porch one evening after supper, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. It had become a habit for Matthew to join the family in the evenings, at Robert's insistence. You have patience and you explain things clearly. That is rare. You think so? Grace asked, pleased by the compliment. I know so. Matthew was whittling a piece of wood, his hands sure and steady as they shaped it into something. I did not get much schooling myself. Had to leave when I was 12 to help my father full time. Sometimes I regret that. There is so much I do not know. You know the things that matter, Grace said firmly. You know how to work hard and how to treat people right and how to keep your head in a crisis. Those are not things you learn from books. Matthew looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes searching her face in the fading light. You see the best in people, Grace. That is a gift, too. Something in the air between them felt charged, electric. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Matthew leaned slightly closer, and she thought for a wild moment that he might kiss her right there on the porch. Then Jacob's voice rang out from inside the house, calling for Grace to come help with something, and the moment shattered. Matthew pulled back, clearing his throat, and went back to his whittling. Grace excused herself and went inside, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. But after that night, things shifted between them. The awareness that had always been there became impossible to ignore. They found excuses to be near each other, to touch in small, innocent ways. Matthew would help Grace down from her horse, his hands lingering on her waist. Grace would stand close to him when they looked at something together, their shoulders brushing. Neither of them spoke about it directly, but it was there, growing stronger every day. Robert Thompson was no fool. He saw what was developing between his daughter and his hired man. One evening in late May, he asked Matthew to walk with him after supper. They headed out toward the corrals, and Grace watched them go with a mixture of hope and nervousness. She knew her father liked Matthew, but that did not necessarily mean he would approve of him courting his daughter. She did not have to wait long to find out. When Matthew returned to the house an hour later, his face was serious but his eyes were bright. He found Grace in the kitchen where she was finishing up the last of the dishes. Elizabeth had tactfully disappeared somewhere, leaving them alone. "Grace," Matthew said, his voice low and intense. "I need to talk to you." Grace dried her hands on a towel, her heart hammering. "All right." Matthew took a deep breath as if gathering his courage. "Your father and I just had a long conversation about my prospects and my plans and my intentions." He paused. "About you. What did you tell him?" Grace whispered. "The truth. That I have been half in love with you since the day I pulled you out of that creek. That I think about you every moment I am not working and most moments when I am. That I know I am just a hired hand with nothing to offer but my 2 hands and my determination. But that I would spend the rest of my life working to be worthy of you if you would give me the chance." Matthew took a step closer. "Your father did not throw me off the ranch, which I take as a good sign. He said I could speak to you and that it would be your choice." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "Oh, Matthew, I know it is fast," Matthew hurried on. "I know we have only really known each other 6 weeks. If you need time, I understand. I am not going anywhere. I just needed you to know how I feel, Grace. You have become everything to me." Grace did not let him say another word. She crossed the distance between them and reached up to cup his face in her hands. "I love you too," she said simply. "I think I have loved you since the moment you rode into that creek for me. You are the bravest, kindest, most wonderful man I have ever known, and I do not need more time to know that I want to spend my life with you." The smile that spread across Matthew's face was like the sun coming up. He wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her close, and then he was kissing her, soft and gentle at first, then with growing passion. Grace kissed him back with all the feeling she had been holding inside for weeks, her fingers threading through his hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I am going to marry you, Grace Thompson," he said fiercely. "I swear it. I do not have a ring yet, do not have land of my own or much money saved, but I am going to work every day until I can give you everything you deserve." "I do not need everything," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "I just need you." They stood there holding each other in the kitchen, the lamp casting warm light over them, and Grace thought she had never been so happy in her entire life. When her mother came back a few minutes later and found them still wrapped in each other's arms, she just smiled and told them she was heading to bed, as if finding them embracing was the most natural thing in the world. Over the next few months, Matthew worked harder than ever. He took on extra tasks, volunteered for the difficult jobs, proved himself indispensable to the ranch's operation. Robert, impressed by the young man's dedication and integrity, promoted him to foreman, putting him in charge of the other hands and giving him more responsibility. It came with better pay, and Matthew saved every penny he could, building toward the future he wanted to create with Grace. They courted properly under the watchful but approving eyes of Grace's parents. Matthew would take Grace riding on Sunday afternoons, the two of them exploring the land around the ranch, talking and laughing and falling more deeply in love. They went to the town dances in Yuma, where Matthew proved to be a surprisingly good dancer, despite his claims that he had 2 left feet. They sat together on the porch in the evenings, planning and dreaming about what their life would look like. "Your father has offered to let me buy into the ranch," Matthew told Grace one night in August. They were sitting on their favorite bench near the house, the stars brilliant overhead. "He said he would sell me a quarter interest, let me pay it off over time from my wages and my share of the profits. It would make me a partner, Grace. It would give us security." "What did you say?" Grace asked, though she already knew from the excitement in his voice. "I said yes, of course." "If that is what you want." Matthew turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I know I had talked about starting my own place, but Grace, your father has built something good here, something solid, and he is offering me a chance to be part of it, to help build it bigger and better. To have a real home and a real future, with you." "It is what I want," Grace said, squeezing his hands. "I love this ranch, and I know you do too. We can build our life here, Matthew, together." Matthew pulled her close and kissed her sweet and long, and Grace melted into him. When he pulled back, his eyes were serious. "Then I have one more question to ask you, and I want to do this properly." To Grace's surprise, Matthew slid off the bench and down onto one knee. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. When he opened it, Grace gasped. Inside was a simple gold band with a small but beautiful sapphire, the deep blue stone catching the starlight. "Grace Thompson, you are the strongest, smartest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You are my best friend and my greatest blessing, and I cannot imagine spending a single day of my life without you in it. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my days trying to make you as happy as you have made me?" Tears were streaming down Grace's face now, but she was smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Matthew, of course I will marry you. Nothing would make me happier." Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around in a circle while she laughed and cried at the same time. When he set her down, they kissed again, long and deep, sealing their promise to each other under the Arizona stars. They were married in October, when the worst of the summer heat had passed, and the land was turning gold and amber. The ceremony took place at the small church in Yuma, with half the town in attendance. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit her, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Matthew had ridden out at dawn to pick himself. Matthew wore a new suit, the first he had ever owned, and he could not take his eyes off his bride the entire ceremony. Jacob stood up as best man, and Grace's closest friend Martha from town served as bridesmaid. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew kissed Grace with such tenderness and joy that several of the women in attendance were seen dabbing at their eyes. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed an army. There was music and dancing, and Grace danced with her new husband until her feet ached, then danced some more. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Matthew and Grace slipped away to the small house that Robert had helped Matthew build over the past months. It was just 2 rooms for now, a bedroom and a main room that served as kitchen and living space. But it was solid and well made, with glass windows and a good stove and a wide bed that Matthew had built with his own hands. It sat on a rise about a quarter-mile from the main house, close enough to be part of the ranch but far enough to give them privacy. Matthew carried Grace over the threshold, and she laughed with delight as he set her gently on her feet inside their new home. Someone, probably her mother, had been there earlier and lit lamps, so the space glowed warm and welcoming. There were wildflowers in a jar on the table and fresh linens on the bed. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stone," Matthew said softly, pulling Grace close. "It has a nice sound to it," Grace said, looking up at her husband with love shining in her eyes. "Mrs. Grace Stone, I like it very much." They came together then, husband and wife, and Grace discovered that being loved by Matthew Stone was even more wonderful than she had dreamed. He was gentle and patient, attentive to her every response, and by the time the moon had risen high in the sky, Grace understood in her bones that she had married exactly the right man. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the following year. Matthew threw himself into his work as partner in the ranch, and his ideas and innovations helped increase the herd and improve the profits. He and Robert worked together seamlessly, with Robert's experience and Matthew's fresh perspective combining to make the ranch more successful than ever. Grace kept busy with the house and with helping her mother, and she began teaching 2 afternoons a week, instructing the children of neighboring ranches and some of the families from town. She discovered she loved it even more than she had expected. She and Matthew were blissfully happy, carving out a life together in their little house on the rise. They talked about everything, laughed easily, supported each other's dreams. Matthew was building a larger house for them, working on it in his spare time, planning for the family he hoped they would have. Grace helped when she could, handing him tools and holding boards steady while he hammered. In the spring of 1885, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Matthew on a sunny afternoon when he came in from working with the cattle. He had been worried because she had been quiet at breakfast, and his face showed concern when he walked through the door. Grace took his hand and placed it on her still flat belly, then smiled up at him. "We are going to have a baby," she said simply. For a moment, Matthew just stared at her, as if he could not quite process the words. Then understanding dawned and his face transformed with joy. He let out a whoop that probably carried all the way to the main house and lifted Grace clean off her feet, spinning her in a circle just as he had the night he proposed. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are having a baby. Grace, you have just made me the happiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Grace was sick in the mornings for the first few months and tired easily as she grew larger. Matthew was endlessly solicitous, treating her like she was made of spun glass, until Grace finally had to tell him she was not an invalid and still perfectly capable of walking from the house to the barn by herself. But his concern came from love, and she could not truly be annoyed with him. They finished the new house just in time, moving in 3 weeks before Grace's due date in late November. It was 3 times the size of their first little house, with a proper kitchen and a parlor and 2 bedrooms, with room to add more as their family grew. Matthew had built a beautiful cradle from oak, sanding it until it was smooth as silk, and Grace had sewn tiny clothes and blankets, preparing for the baby they could not wait to meet. Their son was born on a cold November night, arriving after a long but uncomplicated labor with Elizabeth and the doctor from town in attendance. Matthew paced holes in the floor of the parlor until Elizabeth finally took pity on him and led him into the bedroom. He was at Grace's side when their son took his first breath and let out an indignant wail. Grace was exhausted but radiant, her hair damp with sweat, her eyes shining with tears of joy. Matthew looked down at the tiny red face of his son and felt his own eyes fill. "He is perfect," Matthew whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Grace, you are amazing. Look what we made." They named him Robert Jacob Stone after both his grandfathers, but they called him Robbie. He was a healthy, lusty baby with his mother's dark hair and his father's eyes, and both Matthew and Grace fell completely and irrevocably in love with him. Those early weeks were exhausting, with sleepless nights and constant feedings, but they were also magical. Matthew would rock Robbie for hours, singing to him in a low, off-key voice that nevertheless seemed to soothe the baby. Grace would watch them together and feel her heart so full she thought it might burst. The ranch continued to thrive. Matthew proved to be not just a good foreman but a natural leader, and the men respected him. He was fair but firm, always willing to work alongside the hands rather than just giving orders. Robert, growing older now, began to step back more, content to let Matthew take on more of the day-to-day responsibility. The two men had developed a relationship that went beyond business, a genuine friendship and mutual respect that warmed Grace's heart. Her father had become the father Matthew had lost, and Matthew the son Robert had never had in addition to Jacob. Jacob himself had grown into a capable young man. At 19, he was nearly as tall as his father and learning the business from both Robert and Matthew. He adored his little nephew and could often be found making faces at Robbie to make the baby smile. He had also started courting Martha's younger sister Emma, and Grace suspected there would be another wedding in the family before too long. Time moved on as it always does. Robbie grew from baby to toddler, an energetic little boy who loved to follow his father everywhere and play in the dirt with his toy horses. Grace went back to teaching, bringing Robbie with her on the days when Matthew was working far from the house. In the fall of 1887, Grace gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Ann, called Maggie. She was smaller and quieter than Robbie had been, with her father's dark hair but her mother's hazel eyes. Matthew was even more besotted with his daughter than he had been with his son, if that was possible. Grace would find him just sitting by Maggie's cradle, watching her sleep with the most tender expression on his face. "I never knew I could love like this," Matthew told Grace one night as they lay in bed with Maggie sleeping in her cradle beside them and Robbie in his own small bed in the next room. "I thought I understood when I fell in love with you, but this is something else entirely. This overwhelming need to protect them, to give them everything, to make sure they are happy and safe always." "I know," Grace said softly, snuggling against her husband's side. "It is terrifying and wonderful all at once, but we will do our best, Matthew. We will love them and teach them and be there for them. That is all any parent can do." The years continued to pass in a blur of work and love and family. Robert Thompson died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1889, his heart simply giving out one night. He was 68 years old and had lived a good, full life, but his passing hit the family hard. Elizabeth moved in with Matthew and Grace for a while, needing to be surrounded by family in her grief. Matthew had lost his own father years ago, but Robert's death affected him deeply. The older man had been a mentor, a friend, a second father, and his absence left a hole. But life on a ranch does not stop for grief. There was still work to be done, cattle to tend, business to manage. Matthew stepped fully into the role of owner and operator, with Jacob working as his right hand. Together, they kept the ranch running smoothly, honoring Robert's legacy by continuing to build on what he had started. Elizabeth eventually moved back to the main house, but she remained a constant presence in their lives, helping with the children and the endless work that came with running a large household. She had aged in the year since Robert's death, her hair gone completely white and her step slower, but she was still sharp as a tack and her advice was invaluable. In 1891, Grace gave birth to their third child, another son they named Samuel. He was a surprise in many ways, coming 4 years after Maggie when Grace had thought they might be done having children. But he was a welcome surprise, a sunny-tempered baby who seemed to smile from the moment he entered the world. Robbie, now 6, and Maggie, now 4, were fascinated by their new baby brother. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Matthew bought out Robert's remaining share from Elizabeth, who insisted she did not need the money and wanted to see the ranch stay in the family. It was his now, truly his, the dream he had worked toward for so many years finally realized. But it meant nothing without Grace beside him and their children running through the rooms he had built. One evening in the summer of 1893, Matthew and Grace sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the land. The children were in bed, worn out from a day of playing in the creek. That same creek that had brought Matthew into Grace's life 10 years ago, now safely shallow in the dry summer months. They could hear the distant lowing of cattle and the evening song of birds settling in for the night. "You remember the day we met?" Grace asked, her head resting on Matthew's shoulder. "Every single detail," Matthew said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I remember seeing you standing on that far bank, so scared but trying to be brave. I remember thinking I would die before I let anything happen to you. I did not even know you yet, but something in me just knew you were important, that you were going to change my whole life." "You changed mine," Grace said softly. "You gave me everything I never knew I wanted, this life, our children, this love. I think about that girl at the creek sometimes, and I want to tell her not to be afraid, that the water is rising but something wonderful is coming, riding through that current to save her." "You saved me right back," Matthew said. "I was just drifting when I came here, looking for work but not really living. You gave me purpose, Grace. You gave me a reason to be better, to build something, to put down roots. You gave me a home." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep purple. 10 years of marriage, 3 children, a thriving ranch, and a love that had only grown deeper with time. It had not always been easy. There had been hard times, years when the rain did not come enough or came too much, cattle lost to disease, money tight, arguments over how to handle things. But they had faced everything together, and their love had been strong enough to weather every storm. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked eventually, noting the thoughtful expression on her husband's face. Matthew smiled. "I am thinking that in 3 months it will be 10 years since I rode through that creek to get you, 10 years since the best day of my life. And I am thinking I would like to do something to mark it, to celebrate how far we have come." "What did you have in mind?" Grace asked, intrigued. "A party," Matthew said. "Not a big one, just family and close friends. I want to look around at all the people we love and all we have built and just be grateful, Grace. I want our children to see how much their parents love each other, how strong a good marriage can be. I want them to know that real love exists, that it is worth fighting for and working for and choosing every single day." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, as she still did sometimes when Matthew said things like this. After 10 years, he could still move her to tears with his words, with the depth of feeling in his voice. "I think that is a beautiful idea," she said. "Let us do it. Let us celebrate." So 3 months later, on an October afternoon that was bright and clear and perfect, they gathered everyone important to them for a celebration. Elizabeth was there, of course, looking frail but happy, surrounded by her grandchildren. Jacob was there with his wife Emma and their infant daughter. Martha and her husband came from town. The ranch hands, several of whom had been with them since the early days, joined the party. There was food and music and laughter. Matthew had erected a platform for dancing, the same way they had for their wedding, and as the sun began to set, he took Grace's hand and led her onto it. The musicians struck up a waltz, and they danced together as they had 10 years ago, older now but still so much in love. Their children watched from the sidelines, Robbie and Maggie with their grandmother and little Samuel on Jacob's hip, all of them smiling. When the dance ended, Matthew did not let Grace go. Instead, he kept her close and spoke, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. 10 years ago today, I rode through a flooded creek to bring Grace back home. I thought I was rescuing her, but really she rescued me. She took a drifting cowboy with nothing to his name and gave him a purpose. She gave me love and a home and these beautiful children and a life I could never have imagined for myself. He paused and looked down at Grace, his eyes suspiciously bright. I have worked hard these 10 years, built up this ranch, earned my place here. But none of it means a thing without you, Grace. You are still the best decision I ever made. You are still the first thing I think about in the morning and the last thing I thank God for at night. I love you more today than I did 10 years ago, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is my promise to you for the next 10 years and all the years after that. There was not a dry eye in the gathering. Grace was openly crying now, happy tears streaming down her face as she reached up to cup Matthew's cheek. I love you, she said, her voice breaking. I love you so much, Matthew Stone. You are everything I could ever want or need. You are my partner and my best friend and the love of my life. Thank you for riding through that creek. Thank you for being brave enough to take a chance on us. They kissed then, long and sweet, while their friends and family cheered and applauded. When they finally broke apart, Matthew swept Grace up into his arms, making her laugh and protest that she was too heavy now, that she was not a young bride anymore. But Matthew just held her tighter and spun her around, the same way he had done so many times over the years, and Grace wrapped her arms around his neck and held on. The party continued into the evening, with dancing and storytelling and celebration. Robbie fell asleep on a pile of blankets with 2 of the ranch dogs curled around him. Maggie danced with her Uncle Jacob, her little feet standing on his boots as he waltzed her around. Samuel was passed from person to person, cooed over and cuddled, the baby of the family and thoroughly spoiled by all. As the night grew late and people began to head home or to the bunkhouse, Matthew and Grace walked slowly back to their house, with Elizabeth carrying a sleeping Samuel and Maggie holding Grace's hand, while Matthew carried Robbie over his shoulder. They got the children settled in their beds, tucked in warm and safe, then bid Elizabeth good night as she headed back to the main house. Finally, alone in their own bedroom, Matthew and Grace undressed and climbed into bed, exhausted but happy. Matthew pulled Grace close against his side, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders. This was home, Grace thought. Not the house or the ranch or even the land, though she loved all of those things. Home was this man beside her, the steady beat of his heart under her ear, the warmth of his body, the knowledge that he would always be there. I have been thinking, Matthew said into the darkness, about the future, about what comes next. What comes next? Grace asked, her voice sleepy and content. Robbie is getting old enough to start learning the ranch properly. In a few years he will be working alongside me, and then Maggie and Samuel after him if they want. We will teach them everything we know, pass down what your father and mother taught us. And maybe someday, when we are old and gray, we will sit on that porch and watch our grandchildren play in that creek, and we will tell them the story of how it all began. how the water rose and trapped you on the other side, and how I rode through to bring you back." Grace smiled in the darkness, imagining it. "They will think it is the most romantic story they ever heard." "It is," Matthew said simply, "because it is true, every word of it, and because it led to this, to us, to everything we have built together." They lay quietly for a while, comfortable in the silence, wrapped up in each other and in their thoughts. Grace thought about everything that had happened in 10 years, all the ways their lives had changed and grown. She thought about the scared girl she had been on the bank of that creek, and the woman she had become. She thought about Matthew arriving at her father's ranch with nothing but his skill and his determination, and the man he had become, confident and successful and still so kind. "Matthew," she said softly, do you ever wonder what would have happened if the creek had not risen that day? If I had just crossed back over without incident and we had just been employer and employee's daughter, nothing more?" Matthew was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he said, "No, I do not wonder, because I think we would have found each other anyway. Maybe it would have taken longer, happened differently. But Grace, I believe some people are meant to find each other. Some loves are written in the stars or the land or wherever such things are written." That creek rising was not an obstacle. It was fate pushing us together, making sure we did not miss our chance. "I like that," Grace whispered. "I like thinking we were always meant to be." "We were," Matthew said with certainty, "and we always will be." The years continued to unfold, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Robbie did indeed start learning the ranch business, following his father everywhere and soaking up knowledge like a sponge. He was a natural horseman, something that made Matthew proud beyond words. Maggie developed a passion for books and learning, and Grace taught her everything she knew, nurturing that curious mind. Samuel grew into a happy, adventurous little boy who was afraid of nothing and kept his parents constantly on their toes. Elizabeth passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1896, at the age of 72. She had lived long enough to see her grandchildren growing up, to know that her daughter and son-in-law were happy and successful, to see the ranch her husband had built continue to thrive. Her funeral was attended by half the territory, a testament to the woman she had been and the lives she had touched. Grace mourned her mother deeply, but took comfort in knowing she had lived a full life and had died with no regrets. Jacob and Emma took over the main house, as they now had 3 children of their own and needed the space. Matthew and Jacob ran the ranch as equal partners, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. The ranch expanded, buying up adjacent land when it became available, growing into one of the most successful operations in southern Arizona. The Thompson Stone name became known throughout the territory as synonymous with quality cattle and honest dealing. Through all of this, through the years and the changes and the inevitable losses and challenges, Matthew and Grace's love remained constant. They still sat on their porch in the evenings when they could, still talked about everything and nothing, still found joy in each other's company. They weathered the hard times together, celebrated the good times together, and never forgot how lucky they were to have found each other. On their 20th anniversary in 1903, Matthew gave Grace a painting he had secretly commissioned. It showed a creek in flood, brown water churning between 2 banks, and on one side a woman in a long skirt, and on the other a man on a buckskin horse, riding into the current. It was their story captured in oil and canvas, and Grace wept when she saw it. They hung it in their parlor where everyone could see it, and it became a family treasure, a reminder of how their love story had begun. By then, Robbie was 18, and essentially running the day-to-day operations of the ranch alongside his father. He had his mother's intelligence and his father's work ethic, and Matthew knew the ranch would be in good hands when he eventually stepped back. Maggie, at 16, had started teaching at the school in Yuma, fulfilling her mother's dream in her own way. And Samuel, at 12, was still trying to decide what he wanted to be when he grew up, though he loved the ranch and the cattle as much as his brother did. Matthew was 44 now, Grace 42, no longer the young people who had fallen in love at the creek. There was silver in Matthew's dark hair and lines around Grace's eyes, earned from years of laughing and living. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young cowboy and the rancher's daughter, still felt that same spark that had ignited all those years ago. One spring morning in 1904, Matthew woke before dawn as he always did. He lay for a moment looking at Grace sleeping beside him, her hair loose on the pillow, her face peaceful. 21 years of marriage, 3 children raised, a lifetime of memories made. And still, every single morning he counted himself blessed to wake up next to her. He slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake her, and dressed for the day. He had planned to ride out and check the herd in the north pasture, wanted to see how the new calves were doing. But as he walked outside into the cool morning air, something made him change direction. Instead of heading to the barn, he found himself walking toward the creek. It was running gently this morning, clear and shallow, burbling over the rocks with a peaceful sound. Hard to believe this was the same creek that had risen so violently all those years ago. Matthew stood on the bank and let himself remember that day, the fear in Grace's eyes, the power of the current. The moment he had made the decision to ride through, knowing he might not make it but knowing he had to try. The feel of her arms around his waist on the ride back, the certainty that had settled into his bones that she was his, and he was hers, and nothing would ever change that. "I thought I might find you here." Matthew turned to see Grace walking toward him, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. Her feet were bare and her hair was down, and she looked so beautiful in the early light that his breath caught. "I woke up and you were gone," Grace said, coming to stand beside him. She slipped her hand into his and they stood together, looking at the creek. "I knew you would be here." 21 years ago this month, Matthew said, give or take a few days. Hard to remember the exact date, but I know it was April. "April 15th, Grace said softly. "I remember exactly. It was the day my whole life changed." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the water flow past, each lost in their own memories. Finally, Matthew turned to face his wife, taking both her hands in his. "Grace Stone, I would do it all again. Every single moment. The fear, the risk, all of it. Because it led to this, to us, to the life we have built. You are still the best thing that ever happened to me." Grace reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "And you are mine. My brave cowboy who rode through the current to save me, who has been saving me in 1,000 small ways every day since. I love you, Matthew Stone, today and always." Matthew pulled her close and kissed her there on the bank of the creek, the morning sun warming their backs and the water singing its eternal song beside them. It was a kiss full of history and love and promise, a reaffirmation of everything they meant to each other. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "Come on," Grace said, tugging him toward the house. "I will make breakfast and we can wake the children. Maggie is coming home from town today, remember? She wants to talk to us about something, sounded important in her letter." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and Matthew felt that familiar swell of contentment in his chest. This life, this woman, these children, this land. It was everything he had ever dreamed of and so much more. The ranch would continue long after he was gone, passed down through the generations, a legacy for the future. But more than that, he and Grace had created something beautiful together. They had taken the raw materials of love and hard work and faith and built a life worth living. Maggie's news turned out to be that she was engaged to a young lawyer from Yuma, a good man named David, who Matthew had met several times and liked very much. The wedding was planned for September, and the whole family threw themselves into preparations. It was exciting and bittersweet, watching their daughter prepare to start her own life, to become a wife and eventually a mother herself. But Matthew and Grace took comfort in knowing they had given her a strong foundation, shown her what real love looked like, prepared her for her own journey. The wedding was beautiful, held at the same church where Matthew and Grace had married 21 years earlier. Maggie was radiant in her white dress, and David looked at her the way Matthew still looked at Grace, with awe and devotion and joy. As Matthew walked his daughter down the aisle, he felt Grace's eyes on him from the front pew and knew she was thinking the same thing he was. This was right. This was good. This was how life was supposed to unfold, one generation after another, each building on the love and lessons of those who came before. At the reception afterward, Matthew danced with his daughter and told her how proud he was of her. "You have grown into an amazing woman, Maggie. Smart and kind and strong. Your mother and I could not be happier for you. You and Mama taught me what to look for," Maggie said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "You showed me what love should be. When I met David, I knew Papa. I knew the same way you must have known with Mama. He makes me feel safe and cherished and challenged to be better. That is what you gave her, and that is what I wanted for myself." Matthew had to clear his throat several times before he could respond. "Then you have chosen well, sweetheart. Be happy. That is all your mother and I have ever wanted for you." Life continued its steady march forward. Robbie married a girl from a neighboring ranch in 1906, bringing another daughter-in-law into the family. Samuel, at 14, was starting to make noises about maybe becoming a veterinarian, fascinated by the animals and their care. Matthew and Grace supported all of it, proud of the people their children were becoming. As the years passed, Matthew and Grace settled more into the role of elders, letting the younger generation take over more of the daily work. They were grandparents now, with Maggie and David's first child born in 1905 and Robbie and his wife welcoming twins in 1907. The ranch house rang with the laughter and chaos of grandchildren, and Matthew and Grace loved every minute of it. They still took their evening walks when the weather was nice, still sat on their porch and watched the sunset, still found time to be alone together and remember who they were before they were parents and grandparents, when they had just been Matthew and Grace, two people who loved each other desperately. Those moments were precious, a lifeline to the young people they had been and the love that had started it all. On their 30th anniversary in 1913, the family threw a huge celebration. Robbie and Samuel organized everything, determined to honor their parents and the example they had set. The party was held at the ranch, with people coming from all over the territory to celebrate. Matthew and Grace, now 54 and 52 respectively, danced together to the same song they had danced to at their wedding, and everyone watched with smiles and tears. 30 years, Grace said as they swayed together. "Can you believe it, Matthew? 30 years since we promised to love each other forever." "Best 30 years of my life," Matthew said, "and I plan on at least 30 more, so you better take care of yourself, Mrs. Stone." Grace laughed, the sound as bright and joyful as it had been when she was 20. "I will hold you to that, Mr. Stone." They kept their promise to each other, those 30 more years and more besides. They lived to see all their children grown and successful, to hold great-grandchildren in their arms, to celebrate 50 years of marriage in 1933 when they were both in their 70s. The ranch continued to thrive under Robbie's management, with Samuel working as the resident veterinarian and Maggie's children taking their places in the operation as well. It was a true family business, built on the foundation that Matthew and Grace had laid all those years ago. Matthew Stone died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1936, at the age of 77. Grace was beside him when he passed, holding his hand as she had held it for more than half a century. He went quietly, without pain, slipping away between one breath and the next. Grace mourned him deeply, but she took comfort in knowing they had lived a full life together, had loved each other well, had built something that would last long after they were both gone. She lived another 5 years without him, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them loving her and honoring her. She told the story of the creek and the cowboy who rode through the current to save her so many times that it became family legend. The painting Matthew had commissioned hung in the main house now, and Grace would sit in front of it sometimes, remembering. Grace Thompson Stone died on a spring morning in 1941 at the age of 80. Her children found her in her favorite chair on the porch, a peaceful expression on her face, as if she had simply closed her eyes for a nap and never woken. They buried her beside Matthew in the family cemetery on the ranch, under a big cottonwood tree with a view of the creek where their story had begun. The ranch continued for generations after them, passed down through the family, the Stone name becoming legendary in Arizona cattle country. And every generation heard the story of how it all began, of the creek that rose too fast and trapped a young woman on the far side, and the cowboy who rode through the current to bring her back. They heard how that single act of bravery sparked a love that lasted a lifetime, built a family, created a legacy. And on spring days when the creek ran high with mountain snowmelt, when the water churned brown and powerful between its banks, people said you could sometimes see 2 figures there. A woman standing on one side, and a man on a horse riding through the current toward her, again and again, for all eternity. Riding through the current to bring her back home,